Aliens picked the wrong state, the wrong month, and the wrong week. 12,000 armed hunters were already in the woods before the ships even landed. The aliens called it a primitive backwater. They called it easy. They were wrong on both counts, and in about 40 minutes you're going to find out exactly how wrong. If you like getting hooked early, smash that like button right now, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you'd want aliens to land next, because trust me, this story only gets better from here. Let's get into it. Wyoming in November doesn't ease you into winter, it just hits you with it. The wind comes down off the bighorns like it's got somewhere else to be and doesn't care what's in its way. Frost sits on the truck windshields until 10 in the morning. The grass goes the color of an old dollar bill, and the sky stays that hard, pale blue that makes everything underneath it look small. But there's one thing that wakes this state up every single year in November, and it isn't the weather. It's the orange, hunting season. Up and down the state, men and women had been planning this for months. Tags drawn back in the summer, trucks packed the night before. Coolers loaded, rifles cased, thermoses filled with coffee strong enough to strip paint. By the third week of November, half of Wyoming's working population was either already out in a blind, walking a ridge line, or driving slow down a gravel road with a rifle racked behind the seat and a tag in their wallet. Hank Dorring had been doing this for 31 years. He ran a small spread outside a town called Carbon Junction, a place so small that the welcome sign and the goodbye sign were close enough that some folks claimed you could read both from the same spot if you turned your head fast enough. Hank wasn't chasing trophies anymore. He hunted because his father hunted, because his grandfather hunted, and because there was something about being out before sunrise, breath fogging in front of him, boots crunching frost. That made the rest of the year make sense. That morning, Hank was sitting in a permanent blind on the edge of a stand of cottonwoods, watching a game trail that had produced 2 decent bucks in the last 3 years. His thermos sat beside him. His rifle rested across his knees. The sky was just starting to turn that pale gray that comes right before the sun decides to show up. That's when the light came down. It wasn't a shooting star. Hank had seen plenty of those. This thing moved wrong. It came in slow, almost lazy, trailing a thin line of orange fire, and it didn't burn out. It kept descending, smooth and controlled, like something easing itself down onto a landing pad instead of falling out of the sky. It dropped behind the ridge to the east, and a few seconds later, the ground gave a soft thump Hank felt through the floor of the blind. He sat there for a second, working his jaw the way he did when something didn't add up. Then his radio crackled. It was his neighbor, Russ Coley, 2 ridges over. "Hank, you seeing this? Seeing what? Get on Channel 4. Something just landed out past my north fence, within 20 minutes. Half the hunters in 3 counties were talking over each other on shared radio, channels meant for coordinating who'd shot what and where. Reports came in from all directions. Something had come down near Carbon Junction. Something else had come down 40 miles north near the interstate. A third object had been seen descending over open-range land where exactly nobody lived, which somehow made it worse, because that meant whatever this was had room to spread out. Sheriff Roy Tanner was the first official to get a real look at it. Roy had been sheriff of the county for 11 years, and before that he'd done 2 tours overseas, which meant he'd seen plenty of things that should have rattled him, and had mostly stopped reacting to surprises somewhere around year 2. He drove out toward the coordinates Russ had given dispatch, parked his truck on a ridge, and looked down into the draw below through a pair of binoculars his wife had bought him for his 50th birthday. What he saw down there made him lower the binoculars, raise them again, and lower them a second time, just to be sure his eyes weren't playing tricks in the morning light. It was a ship. Not a plane, not a helicopter, not anything built on this planet. It sat low and wide in the draw, black metal, with a faint shimmer running across its surface like heat coming off asphalt in July. Except it was 31 degrees out and getting colder. A ramp had already lowered. Figures were moving near it. Tall figures, armored figures. Roy keyed his radio. "Dispatch, I need you to get the highway patrol. I need you to get the game and fish department. And I need you to get whoever you can reach at the National Guard Armory in Cheyenne. Tell them exactly what I'm about to tell you, because I need it on record that I said it first, and I need them to actually believe it. Go ahead. Sheriff, Roy took one more look through the binoculars. One of the armored figures lifted what was unmistakably a weapon and gestured toward the open plains beyond the draw, like it was already mapping out territory that didn't belong to it. We have got ourselves a problem, Roy said, and it did not come from this planet. There was a long pause on the radio. Then dispatch came back, voice flat and careful, the way people sound when they're trying not to laugh at something that might actually be serious. Sheriff, can you repeat that? You heard me the first time. What Roy didn't know yet, what nobody in Carbon Junction or the surrounding 3 counties knew yet, was that the things climbing out of that ship had crossed 14 star systems, ended 6 separate planetary conflicts, and had never once failed to bring a world to heel within the first 72 hours of landing. They had a timeline, they had a strategy, they had weapons that could level a city block in a single volley. What they did not have, and had no possible way of knowing they needed, was any concept of what happens when you drop into the middle of armed, irritated, freezing cold rural America during the one single week of the year when every third person within 50 miles is already outside, already carrying a rifle, and already in a foul mood about something completely unrelated to alien invasion. Hank Doring climbed down out of his blind, looked east toward the smoke rising off the ridge, and said something to himself that would later get repeated at every diner counter in the county for the rest of the year. Well, he said, there goes my morning hunt. He racked around into his rifle, climbed into his truck, and started driving toward the smoke instead of away from it. He had no idea yet what he was driving into. He just knew something had landed on his neighbor's land without asking, and around here that mattered more than people from somewhere else would ever understand. By 8 in the morning, 3 things were true across Carbon Junction and the surrounding counties. The first was that nobody believed Roy Tanner over the radio, right up until they saw it with their own eyes. The second was that everybody who did see it reacted in roughly the same way, which was to stop, stare for about 4 seconds, and then go get something out of their truck. The third was that the aliens, whoever they were, clearly had no idea what kind of morning they had just walked into. Commander Holt Maddox stood at the base of the lowered ramp, reviewing the scan data on a handheld display that hovered just above his palm. Maddox wasn't his real name, not in any language a human throat could produce. But the collective's translation systems had assigned him something simple and authoritative sounding for first contact purposes, and Commander Holt Maddox had a nice, official ring to it. He commanded the lead element of the Varan Dominion's 11th expansion fleet, and he had personally overseen the surrender of 4 separate species without firing a single shot, simply by demonstrating overwhelming force on arrival. This region, according to the survey data his fleet had gathered from orbit, was sparsely populated, agriculturally based, and almost entirely undefended by any organized military presence. Population density, minimal. Visible infrastructure, minimal. Detected weapons signatures, scattered, small-caliber, civilian grade. It looked, by every metric his species used to judge a conquest, like the easiest planet they had touched in 300 years of expansion. Sir, said his second, a soldier the translation system had dubbed Lieutenant Garrick Stone, scans show elevated metal signatures approaching from multiple directions. Vehicles, civilian vehicles, Maddox said, glancing at the readout. Likely curious locals, hold position, we demonstrate strength first. Conflict resolves itself. It was, in fairness, a strategy that had worked nearly every single time before. The first truck arrived 4 minutes later. It was Hank's. He parked it on the ridge above the draw, stepped out, and looked down at the ship with the same expression he might have given a dead cow showing up in the wrong pasture. Confused, mildly annoyed. Working out what to do about it. Within 15 minutes, 6 more trucks had arrived along the ridge, parked at angles that suggested nobody had discussed it, but everybody had the same instinct, which was to leave themselves room to turn around fast if things went wrong. Russ Coley was there. So was a retired game warden named Wade Prout, who still carried himself like he was on duty. So was a younger guy named Cody Briggs, who'd taken the week off work specifically to hunt, and was now looking at the ship with the particular outrage of a man whose vacation had just been ruined by something he hadn't even known was a Possibility 20 minutes earlier. Maddox observed the gathering through his ship's external sensors and felt something he hadn't felt in 300 years of conquest, which was a faint, nagging sense that the survey data might have missed a detail or two. "They are not retreating," Stone said. "They are gathering," Maddox corrected. "Likely civilian leadership organizing a formal surrender delegation." "Send the translation broadcast." A voice boomed out from the ship, amplified and slightly metallic, rolling across the draw and up the ridge where the trucks were parked. "Attention, inhabitants. This territory is now claimed by the VERRIN Dominion. Submit peacefully and you will not be harmed." There was a pause on the ridge. Then Wade Prout, who had spent 26 years enforcing hunting regulations on this exact stretch of land, spat into the dirt and said, loud enough for the others to hear, "This is a wildlife management area. Y'all need a permit to be on it." A round of laughter went through the group on the ridge, the kind of laughter that wasn't really about humor. It was about nerves working themselves out the only way men out here knew how. Maddox heard the translated response through his system and stared at it for a full 3 seconds, trying to determine if it was a formal legal challenge, a coded threat, or simply nonsense. His translation algorithms, built across centuries of conquering dozens of species, had never once encountered a target population whose first instinct upon alien contact was to cite a permitting violation. "Lieutenant," Maddox said slowly, "are they regulating us?" "Unclear, Commander." Down on the ridge, Hank had already pulled his rifle out of the truck cab, not because he intended to use it on anything that big. A hunting rifle wasn't going to do much against whatever that ship was made of, but because in this part of the world, you didn't stand in front of something you didn't trust without something in your hands. It was less about firepower and more about principle. Sheriff Roy Tanner arrived next, lights flashing, and pushed through the gathering crowd to get a look down into the draw himself. He'd already put in calls to the Highway Patrol, the Game and Fish Department, and the National Guard Armory. And every single one of those calls had ended with somebody on the other end asking him to repeat himself, slower, like maybe he'd had a rough night. Nobody official was coming yet. Carbon Junction and the open plains around it were, for the moment, on their own. Roy raised a bullhorn he kept in his truck for crowd control during the county fair and pointed it down toward the ship. "This is Sheriff Roy Tanner of this county," he announced. "I don't know what you are. I don't know where you're from, but you are currently parked on private grazing land without permission. And I am going to need you to identify yourselves and state your business before this gets any more complicated than it already is." Maddox listened to the translated message and turned to Stone with an expression that, on his species, indicated something close to disbelief. "They are demanding identification," Maddox said. "From us. Should we comply, Commander?" Maddox straightened his armor, drew himself up to his full imposing height, and decided that the appropriate response to confusion was the same response that had worked on 14 other worlds: overwhelming demonstration of force. He gestured to his troops, and a dozen of them began marching up the slope of the draw toward the ridge, weapons raised, formation tight, exactly the way it had been trained for centuries. It was, without question, the single worst decision Maddox would make all day. Because as that formation crested the ridge and got its first real look at what was waiting for them, every single person standing there had already had the same thought independently. The thought that comes naturally to anyone raised in a place where self-reliance isn't a virtue, it's a requirement. Nobody up here was going to wait for permission from Cheyenne. Hank racked his rifle. Russ stepped up beside him. Wade Prout cracked his knuckles like he was about to write the most satisfying citation of his career. And somewhere behind them, more trucks were already rolling in from 3 different directions. Drawn by radio chatter that had spread across hunting channels faster than any military alert system ever could. The Veran Dominion's first contact with humanity was about to go very differently than Commander Maddox's 300 years of experience had prepared him for, and the worst part, the part he wouldn't fully understand until much later, was that this wasn't even the worst armed crowd he was going to run into today. The formation reached the top of the ridge, and for about 2 seconds, nobody on either side moved. Maddox's lead soldier, A heavily armored trooper the humans would later just call the Big One, raised a weapon that looked like it had been designed specifically to make a person feel small. It hummed with a low charge that vibrated in the air. Hank Doring didn't lower his rifle, neither did anyone else. "Last chance," Roy called through the bullhorn. "Lower your weapons and we can talk this out like reasonable people." The trooper didn't lower anything. Instead, the translation device on his armor crackled to life. "Resistance is not advised. Your weapons are ineffective against our armor." That might have been true under different circumstances. But the trooper made a critical error in that exact moment. The kind of error that comes from studying a species through orbital scans instead of actually living among them for 30 seconds. He turned just slightly to address a second trooper beside him, and in doing so exposed a narrow seam in his armor at the base of his neck, a seam the scans had never been positioned to catch. Cody Briggs, the guy whose hunting trip had just been ruined, happened to be sighted in on exactly that spot, more out of nervous habit than any kind of plan. He didn't think about it. He just did what 30 years of deer season had trained his hands to do the instant a target presented itself. He fired. The shot caught the trooper clean in that gap, and the trooper went down like a dropped sandbag, twitching once before going still. The sound of the shot rolled out across the draw and bounced off the ridges, and for a moment, the entire hillside went completely silent. Then chaos arrived, and it arrived from every direction at once, because the gunshot did something that nothing else that morning had managed to do. It told every hunter listening on the radio channels, every rancher who'd driven out to see what the commotion was, every single person within 5 miles who already had a rifle in their truck. Exactly what they needed to know. These things could be hurt, these things could be stopped. And nobody up here was going to wait for the National Guard to figure out how to file the paperwork on an alien invasion before doing something about it themselves. More shots rang out almost immediately. Not coordinated, not strategic, just dozens of people responding the way they'd respond to anything threatening their land, their families, or their cattle. Maddox's formation, trained for war against species with shields and energy weapons and organized defensive doctrine, had absolutely no answer for a disorganized mob of armed civilians who had spent their entire lives shooting at moving targets in difficult terrain and terrible weather. Maddox watched the feed from his ship's external cameras with mounting horror as 3 more of his troopers went down in the space of about 90 seconds. Picked off by hunters using weapons his own intelligence reports had rated as negligible threat. "Status report," Maddox snapped. "We are taking casualties, Commander," Stone said, voice tight. "The humans are. They are extremely accurate. They are farmers. They appear to also be marksmen, Commander," down on the ridge. Sheriff Roy Tanner had already shifted from trying to negotiate to trying to organize. He'd spent 2 tours overseas learning exactly how fast a situation could turn, and he recognized the moment this one had turned. He started directing people by instinct, the same instincts that had kept him and his unit alive a long time ago in a different desert on a different continent. "Spread out," he shouted. "Don't bunch up, use the terrain." It wasn't a formal command structure. Nobody here had signed up for a chain of command. But Roy's voice carried the particular authority of someone who clearly knew what he was talking about, and in a moment like this, that was enough. Trucks repositioned. People took cover behind ridgelines and rock outcrops they'd hunted around for years and knew better than any orbital scan ever could. Maddox made the only decision his training allowed. He ordered a tactical withdrawal back to the ship, intending to regroup, reassess, and return with a revised strategy. It was the correct call by every standard of his species' military doctrine. It also meant retreating downhill, across open ground, in full view of several dozen people who had spent their entire lives hunting animals that were considerably faster and considerably better at hiding than a column of armored soldiers jogging across exposed terrain in broad daylight. It did not go well for the Varan Dominion. By the time Maddox's remaining troops made it back to the ramp, he had lost nearly a third of his landing force, not to superior weapons, not to superior tactics, but to what his intelligence officer would later describe, with visible difficulty getting the words out, as an unanticipated density of armed, accurate, and extremely motivated civilians. Maddox stood at the top of the ramp, watching the ridge above the draw, where the silhouettes of trucks and people remained steady, unmoving. Clearly not retreating, clearly not afraid, clearly waiting to see what he'd do next. "This world survey data was inaccurate," he said quietly. "Commander," Stone said, "Orbital Command is requesting a status update." Maddox looked at the casualty numbers on his display. He looked at the ridge again. He thought about the small device hovering at his palm, displaying confident projections that this region would be secured within hours. "Tell them," Maddox said slowly, "that local resistance has been underestimated." What he didn't yet know, what would only become clear over the next several hours, was that this single draw, this one ridge outside a town most maps didn't bother labeling, was about to become the smallest of his problems. Because word was already spreading, radios were already crackling across 3 counties. And in towns and ranches and hunting camps scattered across hundreds of square miles of frozen Wyoming plains, more people were already loading rifles, climbing into trucks, and heading toward the smoke on the horizon. The Varan Dominion had landed in the one place on the entire planet where the locals were already armed, already outside, already in a mood, and already completely unwilling to ask anyone's permission before handling a problem themselves. And the real fight, the one that would end up in history books on a planet 14 star systems away, hadn't even started yet. By noon, the Varan Dominion had 3 landing sites active across the region, and all 3 were in trouble. The second site, the one Russ Coley had first reported up near the interstate, had touched down close enough to a truck stop and a row of grain silos that it drew attention almost immediately from long-haul drivers, off-duty oilfield workers, and a handful of ranchers checking fence line nearby. Commander Maddox had ordered that site to establish a secure perimeter and await reinforcement. What it got instead was Earl Whitfield. Earl ran cattle on 11,000 acres that bordered the silo road, and he had exactly one rule about people showing up uninvited on land he considered his responsibility to protect, which was that they didn't get to stay. Earl had pulled feed trucks out of mud holes, fixed fence in blizzards, and once talked down a bull elk that had wandered into his equipment shed by standing perfectly still and saying nothing for 45 minutes. He approached the situation with the same calm, immovable patience. He also had a grandson serving overseas, and something about armed strangers showing up uninvited on American soil put a particular edge in him that his neighbors had never seen before. When the Varan troopers at that site attempted to establish their perimeter by ordering nearby vehicles to stop and submit to inspection, Earl responded by driving his grain truck, fully loaded, directly through the section of perimeter closest to the silo, scattering troopers and equipment in every direction. He climbed out of the cab unarmed, looked at the alien soldiers struggling to get back to their feet in a spreading pile of spilled grain, and said, "You're on County Road right-of-way. Move your ship." The soldiers, for reasons that would later be debated extensively by Varan military analysts, did not immediately retaliate, partly because several of them were still buried under 1,000 pounds of barley, partly because nothing in their training had prepared them for a human being who appeared completely unbothered by the presence of armed extraterrestrials. By the time backup arrived, that backup consisted of a dozen more trucks, several dozen more rifles, and a tow truck driver named Donnie who had, for reasons nobody fully understood even at the time, brought a chain. The third landing site, out on the open range where supposedly nobody lived, ran into a different kind of problem entirely. It had set down less than 4 miles from a hunting camp that had been operating continuously for 2 weeks, housing 11 hunters from 3 different families who had been tracking a particular herd of elk through that exact stretch of terrain since opening day. These were people who had spent 2 solid weeks reading the land, the wind, the movement patterns of animals far more cautious and far better camouflaged than anything Varan scout troopers had ever trained against. When Varan scouts moved out from that landing site to assess the terrain, they walked directly into the most heavily prepared, most patient, most quietly furious group of marksmen in the entire operation. These were hunters who had passed up shots on legal trophy bucks because the angle wasn't perfect, who had sat motionless in 14-degree weather for 6 hours waiting for the right moment. When that same patience and precision turned toward armored alien scouts who had no concept of using terrain for cover, the results were not close to fair. Back at the Central Command ship, Commander Maddox reviewed the incoming reports with the particular stillness of someone watching a carefully constructed plan collapse in real time. Casualties at Site 2, Stone reported. Significant losses at Site 3, Site 1 perimeter breached by. A grain vehicle, Commander. A grain vehicle. Yes, Commander. Maddox stared at the tactical display, where red markers indicating Varan losses were multiplying faster than any previous campaign in fleet history. 14 conquered systems, 6 resolved conflicts. None of them had prepared him for this. Orbital Command is requesting clarification on troop loss rates, Stone said carefully. Maddox considered his response for a long moment. Tell them, he said, that the locals appear to treat armed conflict as a seasonal activity they are already equipped for. Sheriff Roy Tanner, meanwhile, had finally gotten through to someone official, a colonel at the National Guard Armory in Cheyenne, who had spent the last hour fielding increasingly bizarre reports and had finally decided to take them seriously after seeing footage forwarded from a hunter's phone camera. Help was coming, the colonel told Roy. Aircraft, personnel, real military response. How long? Roy asked. Couple hours minimum. We've got to mobilize. Roy looked out across the draw, where another dozen trucks had arrived in just the last 20 minutes. Where hunters from towns 30 and 40 miles away had heard the radio chatter and simply driven toward the trouble instead of away from it. The way people out here had always done when something threatened their own. Take your time, Roy said. I don't think we're gonna need you as bad as you think. He wasn't being arrogant, he was being honest. Because as he looked at the gathering crowd on the ridge, men and women with rifles they'd owned for decades, who knew this land better than any satellite ever could, who had spent their entire lives preparing, without ever knowing it, for exactly this kind of fight, Roy understood something the Varan Dominion had not yet figured out. This wasn't a planet they'd caught unprepared. This was the 1 week of the year in the one state where the locals were more ready for a fight than they'd ever been in their lives. And Commander Maddox, watching his casualty reports climb and his strategic options shrink by the hour, was about to discover exactly how big a mistake his survey teams had made when they decided Wyoming, in November, was an easy target. Maddox made his final decision at 1:30 in the afternoon, and it was not a decision born of confidence. It was a decision born of desperation, the kind military commanders make when every previous strategy has failed and pride won't let them simply leave. He committed his reserve force, every remaining soldier across all 3 landing sites, to a single coordinated push toward Carbon Junction itself. If he could secure the town, establish a fortified position, and demonstrate to the surrounding population that resistance carried consequences, the psychological impact alone might be enough to turn the tide. It was the same strategy that had worked on cold, frightened populations across 14 other worlds. Carbon Junction was not cold and frightened. Carbon Junction had spent the last 3 hours organizing. Sheriff Roy Tanner had used his time well. Drawing on every instinct from 2 tour overseas, he'd turned the chaos of armed civilians into something resembling actual structure. Hunters were positioned along high ground, overlooking the single road into town. Ranchers had moved heavy farm equipment, tractors, grain trucks, anything with weight and steel, to create makeshift barriers at choke points. Wade Prout, the retired game warden, had taken charge of coordinating radio traffic with a calm efficiency that made it clear he'd been waiting his whole retirement for something exactly like this. And Hank Doreen, the man whose ruined hunting trip had started this whole thing, stood near the center of town with his rifle, watching the road. Thinking about his father and his grandfather, and every cold November morning he'd spent out in a blind waiting for something to show itself. The Varan advance came up that single road in a tight column, troopers marching in formation behind 2 armored transport vehicles, weapons ready, discipline restored after the chaos of the morning. From the air, it would have looked formidable. On the ground in Carbon Junction, it looked like exactly what Roy had been preparing for. The lead transport hit the first barrier, a line of grain trucks parked nose to tail across the road and ground to a halt. That was the moment Roy had been waiting for. "Now," he said into the radio. What happened next would be described differently by everyone who survived it, because nearly 40 people were involved, all moving with purposes that overlapped but were never formally coordinated. Rifle fire came from the high ground on both sides of the road, concentrated on the exposed troopers moving between vehicles. Tractors with reinforced front loaders rolled forward to flank the stalled transports. Donnie, the tow truck driver with the chain, had hooked it to the rear axle of one transport during the chaos and reversed hard enough to drag the entire vehicle sideways into a ditch. Maddox watched the engagement collapse through his remaining ship sensors, every tactical option closing one after another. His troops were pinned outflanked and taking fire from elevated positions his scouts had never properly mapped, because nobody had told them that every hill in this country had probably been used as a deer stand at some point in the last 50 years. "Commander," Stone said, voice strained, "Central Command is requesting immediate orders." Maddox stared at the display for a long moment, 3 landing sites compromised. A reserve force pinned down in a town the survey data had listed as having a population of under 200. Casualty projections that no fleet commander in 300 years of Varan Dominion history had ever had to report. "Order the withdrawal," Maddox said quietly. "All units. Immediate evacuation to orbit." "Commander, that will mean abandoning." "I am aware of what it means, Lieutenant." Down in Carbon Junction, the retreat became visible within minutes. Varan transports reversed away from the barricade, troopers falling back toward the original landing site in a retreat that had none of the discipline of their initial advance. Hank watched them go, lowering his rifle slowly, the same way he'd lower it after a clean shot during any other November. Except this time, the thing he'd been hunting was retreating off an entire planet. Roy Tanner stood in the middle of the road, watching the dust trail of the retreating column, and allowed himself, for the first time in 6 hours, a breath that didn't feel like it was being held against the next emergency. "Sheriff," Wade Prout said, jogging up beside him, "National Guard's 20 minutes out. They're asking if we still need them." Roy looked west, toward the smoke and dust where the Varan ships were already beginning their ascent. Lifting off the draw and the silo road and the open range, retreating back toward whatever they'd come from. "Tell them," Roy said, "we appreciate the gesture. But I think Wyoming's got this handled." What none of them knew yet, what wouldn't become clear until military analysts pieced together the full scope of the engagement days later, was that the Varan Dominion's entire 11th expansion fleet had just suffered the single worst single-day casualty rate in 3 centuries of recorded conquest. Against a planet whose strongest organized resistance, on paper, was a county sheriff's department with a population of under 200 people in the nearest town. Up in orbit, aboard a ship far larger than anything that had landed, a senior fleet officer reviewed Maddox's incident report with growing disbelief. "They were farmers," the officer said. "They were armed farmers, sir," Maddox replied, his voice carrying the exhausted weight of someone who had learned an extremely expensive lesson in a very short period of time. "Heavily armed. Highly accurate, and apparently this was simply a normal week for them." The officer was silent for a long moment, staring at footage of a grain truck plowing through a tactical perimeter. "Recommendation." Maddox thought about the ridge above the draw, the silhouettes that never wavered. The gunfire that came from every direction at once, with no apparent central command, and devastating effectiveness anyway. "Recommendation," he said, "is that this region be marked for permanent avoidance." The official story, the one that eventually reached newspapers and television networks outside the state, got cleaned up considerably by the time it made it past the first few rounds of government review. Unidentified aerial phenomena, a localized incident successfully contained by local and state authorities. No further details available pending investigation. Nobody in Carbon Junction much cared what the official version said. They knew what had actually happened, and more importantly, they knew who had been standing on that ridge when it mattered. Hank Doreen went back out hunting 2 days later, once the National Guard had finished its sweep of the area and confirmed there was nothing left up in that draw except scorched grass. A few pieces of strange black metal nobody could identify, and one extremely confused Varan transport that had been left behind in the retreat, half buried in a ditch with a tow chain still hooked to its axle. He never did get his buck that season. Said later that after everything that happened, sitting in a blind waiting for a deer just didn't carry the same kind of weight anymore, at least not for a while. But he went back out the next November, same blind, same game trail, because that's what you did out here. You went back to normal because normal was worth defending in the first place. Sheriff Roy Tanner got a phone call a week later from a colonel he'd never spoken to before, thanking him for his quote, "exceptional coordination of civilian response assets during an unprecedented event." Roy thanked the colonel politely, hung up the phone, and told his wife that the government had a funny way of describing a few hundred angry hunters with deer rifles. Earl Whitfield's grain truck, the one that had plowed through an alien perimeter, became something of a local legend. He kept driving it for another 4 years before finally retiring it to a spot near his equipment shed, where it sat as a sort of unofficial monument. Folks driving past would sometimes stop just to look at it, and Earl, when he was in the mood, would tell the story, always ending the same way. Wasn't anything special. Man doesn't get to choose what shows up on his land. He just gets to choose what he does about it. The strange black metal recovered from the landing sites disappeared into government custody within a month. Carted off in unmarked trucks with very little explanation given to the people who'd actually fought for that ground. There were grumblings about that for a while, the kind of grumblings small towns are good at sustaining for years if given the chance. But life in Carbon Junction moved on the way small town life always does, season following season, the way it always has. Up in orbit, far beyond anything visible from a deer blind in Wyoming, the Varan Dominion formally updated its galactic survey records. The planet itself remained marked as a long-term strategic interest, rich in resources, worth eventual reconsideration. But one specific region received its own separate notation, flagged for permanent avoidance, with a warning attached that would be studied by Varan military academies for generations. Population density, deceptively low. Threat level, severe. Notes, regional population demonstrates organized resistance capability without centralized military structure. Civilian population routinely armed. Engagement coincides with seasonal hunting period, during which hostility and preparedness are significantly elevated. Recommend total avoidance during autumn months. Recommend total avoidance generally. Commander Maddox, in his final report before reassignment to a considerably quieter sector of the galaxy, added one additional line to the file. A line that wasn't required by any standard military format, but one he felt needed to be said anyway. "They were not soldiers," he wrote. "They were not trained for war in the way we understand it. They had simply spent their entire lives preparing, without knowing it, for exactly the kind of fight we brought to their door. We mistook their patience for weakness. We mistook their independence for disorganization. Both mistakes were fatal to our operation, and I do not believe any future commander should make them again." Back in Carbon Junction, life settled into its usual rhythm. Trucks rolled down Main Street. The diner kept serving coffee strong enough to wake the dead. And every November, when hunting season rolled back around, a few of the old-timers would tell the story to anyone willing to listen, usually over a beer at the only bar in town. Usually ending with the same line that had become something of a local saying. "Wrong state, wrong month. Wrong week to mess with Wyoming." If you made it all the way to the end of this one, drop a comment and let me know which moment hit hardest for you. Because stories like this only get better with an audience that actually shows up for them. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with somebody who needs to hear what happens when you pick a fight with the wrong patch of ground at the wrong time of year. Thanks for riding along on this one. I'll see you in the next story.